Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Benedict Rogers, co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch and the author of the China Nexus. He sheds light on the protests happening across China, the human rights abuses in the country, and how the Chinese regime's influence has spread into free countries too. Benedict, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
So I want to begin with your book. I have a copy right here, the China Nexus, and you have an interesting story behind it. So can you just briefly tell us why you wrote this book?
Yes, so I first went to China when I was 18 years old to teach English for 6 months in Qingdao on the East Coast. And I had a wonderful time there. I made a lot of friends. I fell in love really with China. But over the subsequent years, I've seen the Chinese Communist Party become increasingly repressive across the board, dismantling Hong Kong's freedoms in breach of an international treaty, committing genocide against the Uyghurs, intensifying the persecution of Christians, the atrocities in Tibet, of course the persecution of Falun Gong and forced organ harvesting, and the crackdown on civil society and lawyers. And independent media and dissidents. And on top of all of that, of course, the threats to Taiwan and indeed the threats to our own freedoms. And I looked at all these developments and I realized that although there are many books on China, there are really very few that put all these different pieces together to show the picture of the increasing repression within China, but also aggression beyond China's borders by the CCP. But I also wanted to put across the message that I'm not anti-China. In fact, I'm very pro-China as a country from my experiences living and working there and traveling extensively. But it's the CCP that I'm a critic of. And I think making that message very clear is really important.
On that note, you do say in your book there's a way to be pro-China, right, but not pro-CCP. So you can kind of explain the differences between these, because sometimes people conflate the two. So how are they different?
Well, we often use the term China as sort of shorthand for the CCP, and that's understandable in conversation. But we should be clear about the difference. China as a country is, of course, a great and ancient civilization with a huge history that long predates the CCP. And being pro-China, I think, means respecting that, valuing that, but most importantly, being on the side of the people of China who are suffering under the CCP. And the CCP, on the other hand, is the regime that currently rules China, but it has no legitimacy. Nobody elected it, and it is, particularly at the moment under Xi Jinping, an extremely authoritarian, you might even say totalitarian now, regime that is suppressing all its people, and particularly anybody who holds a belief that is at variance with the CCP's ideology.
On that note, why is the Chinese Communist Party so against faith? It says it's intrinsically atheist, so what is it about faith that it seems to fear?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a chapter in the book on the persecution of Christians, but the principle applies, of course, to all the groups, the Uyghurs, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong, and anybody who has any spiritual or religious belief. But there are two quotes in the book, one from Pastor Wang Yi, who's now in prison, who was a very prominent house church pastor, and the other from the former US Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback. And both of them use this phrase that the CCP has launched a war against faith. And I think the CCP, I mean, it's always been hostile to faith, but it seems to be particularly so now because it is hostile firstly to any alternative belief system, any gathering of people that it feels it doesn't control and perhaps are not loyal to its beliefs. And in particular, I think it sees, because it's an inherently atheist belief system in the CCP, it sees faith as representing ideals and values and beliefs that can empower people, can give people strength and courage, and it doesn't want people to have those things.
On the note of strength and courage, it seems right now we're seeing all these protests erupting across China. Some are just about the COVID lockdowns there, some are calling for the end of the CCP or even for Xi Jinping to step down, and especially among the younger students, there are calls for freedom. So how do you see these protests? What has changed that so many people are speaking out?
I think the protests are extremely significant. I think they're the most significant protests that we have seen in China since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. There have, of course, been other protests in the intervening years, but mostly the protests until now had been focused on a specific issue, and a lot of them had been focused on labour rights. This is the first time in many years that we have seen such widespread, large-scale protests across so many cities where, as you say, people are not shouting end the zero COVID policy or end the COVID lockdowns, even though those were the things that sparked the protests. But they are chanting Xi Jinping step down, CCP step down, and we want freedom and democracy. And I think that's hugely significant because it tells us that, contrary to what the CCP would like us to believe, the people of China have not actually been indoctrinated by the CCP, and I think we are seeing the boiling over of frustration and discontent that has been simmering for some time with the increasingly repressive nature of the regime, the surveillance state, but also the economic slowdown. And I think Xi Jinping has broken the sort of unspoken pact between the party and the people that previously existed, which was that the CCP would have some degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the people in return for presiding over an economic boom that saw living standards raised significantly, and that in the 90s and early 2000s allowed for a certain amount of limited space. Xi Jinping has dismantled all of that. He seems to be hostile to private enterprise and entrepreneurialism, and is undoing some of the economic reforms of his predecessors. And I think we're seeing Chinese people expressing their discontent both with the repression and with the economic slowdown and the fact that the party has broken that unspoken pact.
Expanding on that, how would, say, Western countries, the US, UK, all these other ones, how would they help the Chinese people who are calling for freedom?
Well, I think first and foremost, we should be messaging very clearly that we stand with the Chinese people, the people who are protesting, and those who are not protesting but who share the same goals. And we should be really clear about that. I think we should be finding ways to get information into the country to circumvent the great firewall of China and to help communicate support to the people of China. And we should also be standing up to the CCP regime in Beijing and signaling, most especially at this time, that if they were to embark on a really serious crackdown, there will be serious consequences. And I think for too long we've allowed the CCP to get away with impunity with atrocities and crimes against humanity. We should be preparing to use really tough targeted sanctions, not against China or the people of China, but against the CCP.
Given how severe these are, given their name crimes against humanity, why isn't the Western world doing more? Is it the entanglement financially, or what's your take on why much of the world is silent?
I think it's probably a combination of factors. I mean, in terms of what's happening in China itself, I think the business and financial connections are the most powerful reason for the rest of the world's silence. That silence is starting to change. More people are speaking up, more governments are speaking up, but they're speaking up but not necessarily acting. And that's what we need to push them to do. In terms of Burma and or Myanmar and North Korea, It's a real tragedy because especially what's happened in Burma over the last year and a half since the coup there, you would have thought that it would command the world's attention. I suppose two factors that has meant it hasn't gained the attention it should probably are, of course, the war in Ukraine, which has commanded most of our attention, and also the legacy of COVID and the economic challenges that we're facing.
That was Benedict Rogers, co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch and author of the China Nexus. And for those watching our full episode, after break, we hear more from him on what can be done in terms of the human rights atrocities happening in China and how we can protect our own freedoms here at home. The full episode is available on our partner platform, Epoch TV. To sign up, click the link down below. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you soon.